Part 3. This is the continuation of the story. The link to the previous parts is in the description of this video. Enjoy watching it. I mulled over how to ask the next question, but he saw the look on my face and grinned. So you and Kristen are friends, for now at least? Good idea, he said. When I went through it, when Kristen left me, I was just lost or worse. So, you would recommend taking it slow? Getting to know each other, talking a lot about what you each want out of life and what you like and don't like? Those little things that can suddenly become a big deal? I asked. Sure, he replied, taking a sip. Tyler's expression was open and encouraging, so I decided to share more. She told me what happened with you too. He nodded, his expression turning serious. Yeah, it was pretty bad, but she says she's changed now, that she'd never do it again. Did she say why? That she couldn't put Ben through anything like that again? He nodded. That explains a lot. Like what? Like her lifestyle since Randy divorced her. He finished his drink, placed the empty can upside down in the sink, and crossed his arms. She was a bit selfish back then, but since her second divorce, she hardly dates. I mean, this town isn't that big, and Ben tells us almost every time she has a date. We're usually the babysitters when she does, so we have a pretty good idea. We all still hang around the same places, so we know if she was with a string of boyfriends. But she hasn't been, like she's almost terrified or something. You thought? He smiled. I'd like to say I thought it was Kristen pining away for her lost love, but that would have stopped the second Marissa and I got married. Then we thought she just didn't want to be thought of as a failure. He shrugged. Her reason makes sense, a lot of sense, actually. He patted me on the shoulder. I think it means she's not the same person she was back then. It means she may have finally gotten her priorities in order and isn't putting herself at the top of that list. I couldn't look at him when I asked the next question, both from embarrassment and fear of the answer. Do you know if she's seeing anyone else? I'm positive she's not. Ben told me all about her and Allison taking you out to get the dog. That was the first time she's ever even talked about another man or seemed happy about meeting one in ages. Maybe almost a year. He notices those things. He's pretty protective, I guess. I'm sure he wonders why she's not with someone again, just like I do. I nodded, contemplating his words as he continued. You've got to wonder about this. She's known you for what, a few weeks? I nodded. And you two left together last night, right? Right. And you spent the night together, right? I gave a sad shake of my head. Just 2 kisses. Good kisses. Hell, great kisses, but still just 2 kisses. A beer here, 2 beers at the bar and grill, and then home to our respective beds by 10. He put on a look of mock astonishment. Not even a little more than that? Just a few kisses? I laughed. Tell me about it. He was still laughing when he left. Having Kyle back after only 3 days reminded me how much busier I was around the house when he wasn't with Whitney. It also reminded me how much happier I felt. Not so alone, too. It was fun spending the afternoon making Russian tanks and soldiers in the basement and painting the cool tin castings. It's easy to see why the father-son bond is so important. Okay, I said to Heather and Randy, who were waiting in my office just before 8 on Tuesday morning. What have you got for me? Randy looked at Heather, who merely nodded in response. She reached into her backpack and handed me a neatly typed memorandum. And yours? I asked, looking at Randy. He wouldn't look at me, but Heather spoke for him. We did it jointly. I ran into him Sunday night, and we spent most of our time going over our 2 memos. Our ideas were roughly the same, so we put it all together into one neat package for you. I looked from her to him, then down at the memo. Is that true, Randy? Yes, he stammered. And this memo contains all of your ideas, the ones you each had on your own? He nodded, looking a bit nervous. I turned to Heather. Why did you decide to do it this way? She shrugged, unfazed by my demeanor. Why should you read essentially the same thing twice? Time is money, you know? This way, you'll get all of the ideas and only have to read them once. We made the ideas more detailed by working together. I looked at them both for a long moment. In the past, I'd had interns who did this, but only because one of them was carrying all of the weight, or they'd switch back and forth on assignments, only doing half the work during the internship for all of the pay and credit. But that didn't seem to be the case here. Okay, I said, tossing the memo aside. Then tell me what you two think is the best idea for a new way to look at this period in classical Roman history. We'll do better than that, Heather said, practically bouncing in her chair. We even came up with a title, and it's enough for a book, too. I raised my eyebrows. Then don't keep me in suspense. Was the empire inevitable? She said. Meaning, I held up my hand for Heather to be quiet so Randy could answer. He cleared his throat. Meaning, did the Roman Republic have to end? How many steps along the way could something have changed? Little things and big things that might have ended the brief monarchy Julius Caesar started and Octavian cemented. And why did it continue after Octavian, after Caesar Augustus died? I thought about it. Not a totally original idea, but still a ton of different ways to tackle it. That's it? I asked. No, Heather answered before I could stifle her. We compare it to a more modern transition from republic to dictatorship to show how history repeats itself. Okay, Heather, I'll bite. Which modern transition do we use? America, she beamed triumphantly. The United States. Her head nodded so hard I thought her teeth might fly out. Sure, we're not there yet, but look at the comparisons. Stratification of wealth, military-industrial complex, the same tired old men, and some women, running our lives from Washington year after year, all their campaigns financed by super-wealthy business interests. Those super-wealthy can keep themselves in power and use the rest of us to maintain that. That sounds a lot like conspiracy theory, I said, intrigued by the idea but wondering what else was there. It's not, Randy interjected. Think about it. The government waves the flag to keep everyone patriotic and focused on their pride as Americans. The Romans did the same thing. Every time there was a threat to the empire, every time the people demanded a return to the republic, the emperors did the same thing. Jesus, Professor, Heather exclaimed. It's how Caesar took total control right from the very beginning. He played the rich off against the poor, promised both something he never really delivered on, and kept them distracted by wars and pride in each other. And Octavian was even worse, Randy added. He practically canonized Caesar before the people so he could follow through with the civil war and maintain power while eliminating his political foes. I leaned back, impressed by their work. The story of Caesar wasn't really in the book, I observed. I know, Heather said, but once the idea took root, I did some quick reading on it. And you? I asked Randy. He already knew all that, Heather answered for him. My quick research consisted of reading a term paper he did for Professor Whitman's class last year. I nodded, still leaning back in my chair and looking from one to the other. The more I thought about their topic, the wider my smile grew. After a minute of silence, they both started grinning too. It's good, isn't it? Heather asked. Uh-huh, I said. Maybe really good. There's been a lot written about the transition from republic to empire, but very little of it has looked at it from the other side. What little things could have changed that would have prevented the whole slide into tyranny? She shot Randy a look, and he blushed under her scrutiny, but the smile didn't leave his face. I was pretty sure he was happier about Heather's approval than mine. Okay, I said, swinging forward in my chair. Here's how this is going to happen. You two spend the next week independently researching as many sources as you can about the conditions in Rome between, say, 100 BC and 47 BC. Make that 110 BC. Land reforms were getting underway around then. Look into stratification of wealth, wars, senators, and ruling bodies. How it was almost hereditary by that time. You will do this separately, understand? Understood, they chimed. Then, get together and give me an outline with sources. Nothing fancy, just the basics. They nodded, and I continued. Then the following week, I want the same thing on the United States from post-World War II to the beginning of Bill Clinton's presidency. Include as many names of long-term senators, congressmen, high-level bureaucrats, and their children or other close relatives in high government positions as you can. Sound doable? I asked. So long as it's just the basics, Heather said. Yeah, Randy chimed in. We can't get that much depth so quickly, just the basics for now. I confirmed their understanding and then gave them both a stern look. But one other thing you need to include in all of that. What? Randy asked. You've got your basic premise, right? You're saying in an article, or more likely a book, that the Roman Republic slid into dictatorship because of certain things, that altering any of those countless little things could have changed that, and that those same certain things are now happening in America. They nodded. Well, don't be totally sold on your hypothesis, okay? Just because we think that's the case, don't set out to prove it by ignoring all evidence to the contrary. If there are any differences, I want them highlighted, underlined 3 times, and made crystal clear. Even if there's a contradiction in the sources, I want the contradiction raised. Am I making myself clear? Because that may change the hypothesis, but it still doesn't scrap the whole thing. Right? They said in unison. Exactly, I confirmed. But if you want the whole thing to be a piece of junk, then ignore anything that disagrees with you and just charge ahead with your own set of facts, making me look like an idiot in the process. Being selective with your facts is for demagogues, Randy said, echoing a sentiment I often emphasized in class. But it's not historians, Heather finished for him. For Christ's sake, I said, you two actually listened in class? They chuckled, their excitement over my reception of their idea and their new project evident on their faces. After a tough summer of loneliness, the first day of classes felt like slipping into a pair of old leather shoes, familiar and comfortable. I knew what to expect, was happy to be where I was, and felt relieved at the simple joy of teaching a group of young men and women who were equally excited about learning. It was nice, almost as nice as returning home to Kyle and Sunny. My routine there was quickly becoming easy and comfortable, although it still had its moments of crisis, loneliness, and bitter memories. I was learning to cope with both the present and the past a little better each day. Look, Dad, Kyle said during breakfast, prodding his finger into a picture on the front page of the Lincoln County Register. I know, I said, lowering the paper. Your mom's on the front page. Why? She started a big trial yesterday. What kind of trial? Some men are charged with selling illegal substances to children. I nodded, aware that Kyle had a soft spot for all children, which broke my heart lately given the predicament he was in. And Mom's trying to put them in jail. That's right, he said, smiling for the first time at the mention of his mom. That's right too, I agreed, then thought of something else. She may be a little late tonight, honey. Why? Because of this trial, they sometimes run late. He thought about it for a moment and nodded. That's okay, I guess. This seems pretty important, right? Sure, but not more important than you, little man. I know. It just can't be helped, I guess. Exactly. But it doesn't mean she loves you any less. I know, Dad. Bored now with the conversation, he turned back to the comics. When Whitney hadn't called by 6:30, I was getting frustrated. Years of experience had taught me that trials, even major felony trials, usually ended for the day by 5. That was more than enough time for her to get home, change, and come pick up Kyle. Definitely enough time for her to at least call. I started calling her cell phone and office phone at 5 minutes to 7, but ended up leaving a string of increasingly frustrating messages. By 9, I was too annoyed to even leave a message anymore. Kyle had been in bed for a half hour, sad and upset, and I hoped she would answer so I could express my frustration, but she still wasn't answering by 9:30, and I just gave up. What did I expect? She'd blown off visitation over the weekend, and it was now clear she was prioritizing this trial again, just as she had during our marriage. Still, she was doing this to her own kid. My senior-level seminar on 20th century foreign policy decision-making finished at 2:20, and as I packed up my materials in the small classroom, I heard someone clear his throat. I looked up to see a man and a woman, both about my age, dressed in slacks, dress shirts, and a sport coat on him with a business jacket on her. They looked weary. He had a natural slouch, and she was tall with hazel eyes that seemed tired. Professor Patterson, the man said. What can I do for you, detective? I asked, snapping my briefcase shut and leaning against the lectern. He shot her a glance, raised an eyebrow, then turned back to me. Shoulder holsters, I explained. Neat haircuts, dressed in jackets. You're either detectives or rogue spies sent here to kidnap me. Since I can't imagine why a foreign government, or even my own for that matter, would want anything to do with me, I figure you're detectives. Am I wrong? Lieutenant Gavers, the man said, then nodded his head at the woman. Sergeant Adams. What can I do for you, Lieutenant? Do you have a few minutes? We'd like to ask you some questions. I looked at my watch. I can give you 15 minutes. Then I have to get home before my son gets back from school. He looked at her again, and she shrugged. Something passed between them in that look and shrug before he turned back to me and started right off with the questions. Were you married to Whitney Patterson? Yes, the prosecutor. That's the one. And you're divorced now, right? Yes. When's the last time you spoke with her? Sunday morning, somewhere around 11. And what was that conversation about? She wanted to drop Kyle off a day early. It was her weekend for visitation. Did that make you angry? A little, but it ended up working out. And why were you angry? None of your business. He looked at the sergeant, who gave a grim smile and took over the questioning. Did she say why she was dropping him off early? Yes. She waited for me to continue, but I was already a bit peeved by their attitudes and the tone of the interrogation, so I decided I'd answered the question. Let them ask the next one. Okay, Professor, she said, her impatience showing. Why was she dropping him off early? She said she was dropping him off early, I stressed, given that I didn't really know if she was telling the truth. There was nothing for Kyle to do at her apartment. He was bored and missed his puppy, and she wanted to start preparing early for her big trial that began a couple of days ago, but I didn't believe her. She asked, catching the qualifier I'd put on my answer. I shrugged. I didn't really think about it. If that's what she said, that's what she said. So you don't trust her? Lieutenant Gavers asked, honing in for the kill shot I had inadvertently given him with my pedantic demand for precise answers. She's my ex-wife, Lieutenant, as of only about a month or so ago. So you'll excuse me if we're not really on the best of terms right now. So it was a bitter divorce, he pressed. Is there such a thing as a cheery one? So it was bitter, Sergeant Adams said, writing in her notebook. When I said nothing to her restatement, Lieutenant Gavers took over again. What did you say when she told you she was bringing him home? I told her to go ahead. Any plans I may have had would just need to be adjusted. Were you angry? No, not even a little. Now you're telling me the proper way to ask the question, Lieutenant, I said, my voice shifting into a more assertive tone. How did her request to bring him home early make you feel? He glared at my tone, and I glared right back at him. The answer to that question, I continued, is frustrated. It was frustrating. We'd already rearranged the weekend schedule to give her time to get set up. Then she missed her first Wednesday night for the same reason. Now she was cutting short her first visit because of work. I was frustrated and sad for Kyle. He doesn't deserve to play second fiddle in his mother's life. I turned to Sergeant Adams, whose face softened, her gaze now avoiding mine. Write it down, Sergeant, frustrated. You didn't miss bitter, so don't miss this one. She turned to Gavers, and he nodded. She wrote it down. Let's cut this short, I said. She dropped him off at the curb. She didn't even bother bringing him to the door or helping him with his duffel bag or anything. And that's the last I've heard from her. What about last night? Sergeant Adams asked. It was a Wednesday. Did she show up? I shook my head, without even bothering to call. Just blew him off. And yes, that did piss me off a lot. So what did you do about it? Gavers asked. I left about 7 messages between her cell phone and her office voicemail from around 7 to about 9:30. The tone of my messages started at annoyed and ended at extremely frustrated. You should have seen Kyle's face as the night wore on without her even bothering to take the time to call. I felt myself shaking with rage at the memory of my little boy's disappointment. Gavers' next words, however, popped my rage like a balloon. She's missing, he said. She didn't show up at work this morning. No one has seen her since she left the courthouse just after 5 last night. My eyes widened, darting between the two of them. So you were at home last night between, say, 4:30 and 8? Adams asked. I nodded. Anyone see you other than your son? I nodded again. My neighbors, the Ruskuses, they saw me probably around 5. We chatted for a few minutes while the kids played, then again at about 6:30, and a couple of times after that when I went out onto the back deck to call Whitney. They were out in their yard all night. Yeah, I said, my voice cracking, my throat dry, having a barbecue. Then Sally and Charlie just sat on the deck talking and watching their kids run around until about 7:30 or so. They weren't out there after that. I saw a movement at the door and looked over Gaver's shoulder to see Professor Whitman. I started to say. Look, I looked at the two detectives. We finished here, Gavers said. Sergeant Adams snapped her notebook shut while Gavers fished around in his jacket pocket. Here, he said, extending a wrinkled business card. If you think of anything, anything, call. Okay. I put the card in my pocket while I watched them leave. They both nodded to Professor Whitman as they walked past him. Luke, is now a bad time? I just stared at him, wondering what I was going to tell Kyle. What is it? It's Whitney, I said. She's disappeared. His eyes went wide. My God. Sorry, I said, snatching up my briefcase. I've got to get home before Kyle gets there. I strode past him without another look. I checked the call history on my home phone and saw a number from Sunday that I didn't recognize. I dialed the number, writing it down on a piece of paper while it rang. Hello, she said. Thank God. Right on the first try. Kristen, I managed. My eyes locked on Kyle in the backyard. Look, she said. Something wrong? Can you come over here? Luke, you're scaring me. What's wrong? It's Whitney. She disappeared. Did a runner or kidnapped? I think it's the second one, I said. The cops interviewed me an hour and a half ago. She didn't show up for work this morning, and no one's seen her since last night. Maybe she just wanted to get away from everything for a while, Kristen said. Not a chance. She's in the middle of a huge trial. If she just took off, she'd get fired and then some. Hell, she'd never work again. Maybe even lose her license or something. Kristen didn't even pause. We'll be right over. 10 minutes later, Ben charged through the house and out the sliding glass door to the backyard. Kristen was close behind him, her face anxious as she looked me over. You holding up? What do I tell him? I asked. Nothing. Not a damn thing. But what if she, set your face in grim determination. If it's the worst case scenario, you tell him when you know for sure. Otherwise, just tell him she's busy and that she'll spend a lot of time with him when the trial's over. Lie to him? Yes, Luke. Jesus Christ, you can't tell him she's missing. If you want to tell him the truth, tell him she's maybe in a ditch somewhere. Or worse. Just the thought of it makes me shudder. These worst-case scenarios raced through my mind, but Kristen was the first to articulate them. An ex-wife or no, Whitney was still Kyle's mother. Also, for the millionth time, I realized there was still some love in my heart for the woman who'd cast me aside. Listen, Kristen said, her voice low and steady. If he thinks she's blowing him off, he'll be hurt and angry and resentful. But sadly enough, there are others in his class. Hell, one in the backyard with him right now, for that matter. They've all gone through the same thing Kyle's been dealing with for the past 5 or 6 months, and this will just seem like an extension of that. But if you tell him she may have disappeared or worse, Jesus, Luke, he'll be a total basket case. He'll have nightmares, and it won't be good. So don't tell him what's going on unless you have to. She was right. Forget absolute morality. Nothing is black and white. The world is comprised of varying shades of gray, and if ever there was a time to lie to your child, this was surely one of them. So what else do? I asked. You let the police handle it, she said. Seeing the look on my face, she rushed to continue. I know it's not going to be easy. I know you'll feel helpless and useless and all that, but there's nothing else you can do. You're a history professor, Luke, not a trained policeman. Still, there's got to be something I can do, I replied. She pulled me in and hugged me tightly. I buried my face in her shoulder and caught a whiff of her shampoo. Peaches, the same as Whitney's. Sometimes, she whispered into my ear, you hold it together, Luke. That's what you can do. You hold it together and be strong in front of Kyle. You be there for him. That's the most important thing you can do right now. Understand? I squeezed her tighter in response, feeling better at the close contact with someone who cared. Now, let's get some dinner going, okay? She said, loosening her grip on me. We'll stay for a while so Kyle's got Ben to play with. Thanks, was all I could think of to say. What are friends for? Then she busied herself in the refrigerator, looking for something to make for dinner. I slept on and off all night. The dreams came back along with the ache in my hip. I was surrounded and shot at. All around me, The Iraqi soldiers were overrunning the trench. New trenches were popping up everywhere I turned. Looking around, my platoon was either dying or dead, and still, I kept shooting as the bullets tore into me. I awoke with a gasp, sitting straight up and panting for breath. My mind was still frozen on the last image in my dream. Whitney being dragged away. I was trying to pick off attackers with a massive machine gun, firing fully automatic bursts that kept missing them. My head swiveled automatically to check the weather outside. I knew it was coming. It was already beginning to drizzle, not much more than a light mist. The skies, bordering dusk and dawn, were slate gray with angry thunderclouds moving across the heavens. A damp gray dawn like so many hundreds of others since that day in southern Iraq. Just like the others, my hip and upper thigh ached to the bone, as if bullets and shrapnel were still clawing their way into my depths. The only difference between this and all the others before it was that Whitney had disappeared without a trace. On this damp gray dawn, my boy's mother was gone. The urge to do something, to get off my butt and go looking for her, squirmed around in my brain, telling me I needed to act. Then Kristen's words came back, and I couldn't fault her logic. What the hell did I know about finding a kidnapping victim? But there was something there, something I couldn't put my finger on. The more I thought about it, the more my brain refused to cooperate in bringing it to the forefront. 2 hours later, though, Kyle noticed something and commented on it. That's when it hit me, all of it. Not just the answers to my endless questions, but the whole picture. It came out of nowhere and punched me right between the eyes. When it hit me like a freight train, I felt compelled to ignore Kristen's advice and give in to a large degree of common sense. Whitney's disappearance and the resulting delay in the high-profile illegal substances trafficking trial was front-page news in the Register. I read the article twice, looking at the pictures on the front page of both Whitney and the defense attorney, Loban Dunlop. He looked like a typical narcotics defense attorney, the kind seen in all the television shows. Expensive blue suit, white shirt with French cuffs, and diamond-encrusted cufflinks. He had a square jaw, a wide smile with perfectly capped teeth, and hair perfectly coiffed and held in place with so much hairspray it could catch a bullet. He oozed insincerity from his pores. Just as I woke up, something in the article reignited the little worm in my brain. It was the bare facts. Whitney had disappeared, and Dunlop was demanding an immediate resumption of the trial or declaring a mistrial, which he claimed would end in the permanent dismissal of all charges against his client. When I held the paper up to Kyle, the bombshell dropped. "Why is Mom in the paper?" he asked, pointing at the headlines. I lowered the paper, my eyes narrowing. "Charlie." He pointed to the pictures on the front page. "Sure, Charlie. He's a lawyer like Mommy. He came over on Sunday morning while I was eating." I flipped the paper back to the front page. "This is the man she called Charlie," I pointed out. "Yeah," he said, then went back to reading his comics, forgetting his initial questions. I was left dumbstruck. Charlie Charles L. Dunlop. It wasn't just an email address. It was Whitney's connection to the defense attorney. The realization hit me hard. Whitney had been involved with the lawyer while the case was pending, and now that the trial was underway with a strong case against his client, she had suddenly disappeared. It didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why Whitney was missing. I left the table to find Gaver's business card so I could share my newfound information. Card in hand, I picked up the phone and stepped out onto the deck to make the call, away from Kyle's ears. Just before I started dialing, another series of thoughts began tumbling through my mind. When did Dunlop start pursuing Whitney? The presumed answer was once she was assigned to the prosecution. Why did he go after her? To get inside information on the prosecution's case? To conspire with her to throw the trial? If so, why did Whitney even allow it to happen? That would have created a scandal that could derail her career. Before dialing Gavers, I needed to do some research. "What are you doing, Dad?" Kyle asked as he put his bowl and glass into the dishwasher. "I'll only be a few minutes," I said, rushing to the den and clicking onto the internet. A search of the Register's archives gave me all the information I needed in less than 10 minutes. Initially, the defendants had an attorney named Leland Smithers, who stayed on the case until 3 months ago when Dunlop's name started appearing as the defense attorney. 3 months ago, which was well after our divorce was filed. My eyes stared at the screen, anger surging through my veins. That sleazy lawyer had set out to destroy my marriage to gain an advantage in securing acquittals for a couple of low-life heroin dealers. Driving Kyle to school, I made my decision. Forget Gavers and the police. I wanted my revenge. My Thursday classes were both morning classes, and the second one finished by noon. To this day, I don't really remember much about the classes. I just stood there, answering questions posed and nearly sprinting to my car when the second class finally finished. Luke. I heard Doug calling from behind me, but I didn't stop. I waved and hopped into my car, tearing out of the parking lot. I needed to think, formulate a plan, and gather as much information as possible in the next 5 hours. I didn't want to rush off half-cocked and act on assumptions while ignoring any facts that contradicted my hypothesis. There was, I suppose, a chance that Dunlop was not the mystery man, but that chance seemed slim. If nothing else, the additional information would be vital for planning. 3 hours later, I was in my den, deep in thought. My research had turned up some interesting facts. First, Charles L. Dunlop had been an attorney for 14 years and was just shy of 40. He had practiced criminal defense law his entire career, first with the Public Defender's Office and then on his own for the past 9 years. His trial record was about 50-50, which seemed surprisingly good. Most of his cases never went to trial. They were frequently dropped for no apparent reason. Moreover, the newspaper accounts suggested that several jury acquittals were unexpected. It seemed Dunlop had a questionable background, leading to obvious questions. How did Whitney not know about his past? And assuming she did, why would she succumb to his advances? That, of course, led me to the more troubling conclusion that our marriage was already over in her eyes. The Labras, Carlo and Vincent, owned a string of 14 pizza parlors throughout the Chicago suburbs. News accounts strongly hinted they were connected to the Chicago outfit. In the newspaper pictures, Carlo appeared to be around 50, short, chunky, and bald. Vincent was younger by a few years, also short but lean and wiry, with thinning hair combed straight back and acne scars on his cheeks and chin. In both pictures, they looked dangerous. Something about the way they stared at the camera sent chills down my spine. The Labras were being tried in state court for distributing heroin through their pizza parlors, but the state case was merely a precursor to a larger federal indictment for RICO violations. Those indictments had come down the previous month, based on the theory that illegal substances were being shipped into the country hidden within pizza-making inventory. Speculation suggested that if the state case failed, the Labras would still face charges at the federal level. However, if they didn't win the state case first, the results of the federal case would be irrelevant. They could face decades in prison on the state charges. I had a questionable mob lawyer and his 2 clients to figure out what they had done with Whitney. Assuming she wasn't already dead, I needed to find a way to get her back. In the process, I had to connect Dunlop to the kidnapping without drawing attention to myself. I suspected Carlo and Vincent might have had a hand in Dunlop's scheme that impacted my marriage, but I still didn't want to run afoul of the mob. It would be nice to expose them, but it wasn't a priority. That's when I began to have serious doubts. If I got caught, I was putting Kyle's life at risk. I didn't need a group of dangerous individuals gunning for me, potentially putting Kyle in harm's way. I also didn't want to be on the run for the rest of my life, moving my son from one secret location to another. I was about to give up when the doorbell rang. "Professor Patterson," Lieutenant Gavers said when I opened the door, "May we come in for a moment?" I looked at my watch. It was 10 after 3, and Kyle would be home any minute. "This way," I said, leading them to the back deck. "Kyle doesn't know anything yet, and I don't want him to find out anything until we know what's going on." Gavers, with Sergeant Adams in tow, followed me through the house to the back deck. I let my dog, Sue, charge out ahead of us, then slid the door closed behind us. "Heard anything yet?" I asked. Gavers paused, then turned to Sergeant Adams. "We have a few follow-up questions," she said, flipping open her notebook. I waited, glaring at them. "Did your ex-wife wear any jewelry?" she asked. I closed my eyes, picturing her. Yes, a round gold locket on a gold chain. There was a picture of Kyle inside. She nodded and made a check mark in her notebook, then sighed and looked at Gavers. He narrowed his eyes and turned to me. "Why did you get divorced?" he asked. "None of your business." He sighed. "I'm afraid it is my business, Professor. It's very much my business, and unless you want us to arrest you and take you in for questioning of a more formal nature, you'll answer my question. Why did you get divorced? We know you filed, so why? I looked from him to Adams. Her face showed embarrassment at the whole thing, but Gavers showed only patience. I glanced at Adams and then replied, because she said she didn't love me anymore. After all our years together, she just didn't love me anymore. She was bored, stuck in a rut, she said. I don't know why I didn't stop her. I make good money, take care of the house and Kyle. I thought we were fine. I felt emotion rising in my throat and fought to hold it down. My final words came out as a forced croak. I still don't know why. Adams looked at the ground, still, as I finished. Was she seeing someone else? Gavers pressed forward. I don't know. I lied, then softened the lie. Maybe she wouldn't tell me. Just that there was someone, but it wasn't romantic. That's what she said, at least. Do you know who this somebody might have been? I turned to look at him. He was staring at me intently, and I forced myself to maintain eye contact as I answered. Not a clue. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his right eyebrow rose. Any guesses? I shook my head. Could have been anyone, someone she worked with or something like that. She worked long hours, always coming home at 7:30 or 8. She had plenty of time. He just stared at me, and I could tell he suspected I was lying. No matter how hard I tried to suppress it, there was something about his expression that prompted a smirk on my lips, a smirk that seemed to say, yeah, I know you know I'm lying. Now, try to do something about it. You know, he said after a moment, this paints you in a whole different light. How so? She was cheating. You're divorced now, but you're still furious. Furious enough to want to kill her? Really? I replied. Really, he agreed. Good luck proving it, I said, unable to keep from sneering. I have a rock-solid alibi for the whole night, and you know it. I saw the uniforms interviewing Sally Ramisa next door when I got home. Or didn't you speak with him yet? Maybe you got someone else to do it for you. I laughed a bitter, impatient laugh. Yeah, right. I did a quick internet search for hitmen who killed cheating spouses, paid the retainer, and they came right over. Wouldn't be the first time, Adams said, looking revitalized by Gavers' aggressive questioning. I know, I said. Family members or ex-husbands are usually the first ones you look at. Makes sense, but you've already looked and you know it's not me. Gavers tried a different approach. If you're withholding something, anything, it can be charged with accessory. Nice try, Lieutenant, but no dice. And good luck with any obstruction of justice charges you want to threaten me with. He stared at me, his jaw tightening with frustration and anger. So if we're done here, I said, noticing the front door open, I think my son's home. They both glared at me, but Sergeant Adams recognized the futility of further questioning when I walked past them and back into the house. Hey, little man, I said, scooping Kyle into my arms as they walked past me and let themselves out the front door. We spent the next hour getting his homework done. Then Kyle went outside to play with the Ramisa kids and our dog, Sonny. I spent the time thinking everything through. Point 1. If I told the police what I knew, they would likely bring Dunlop in for questioning. He would never crack. He was an attorney, after all. Worse, if he didn't crack, his only recourse would be to harm Whitney and hide the body somewhere it could never be found. The police rules favored criminals. I was under no such constraints. Point 2. Yes, Whitney had apparently cheated on me. In my eyes, that was the real reason for the divorce. However, that didn't mean I wanted my son's mother to suffer, assuming she was still alive. I had to save her, and I needed to ensure that I wasn't killed in the process. I wanted to live, but my bigger fear was leaving Kyle as an orphan. Point 3. Assuming I could find Whitney and she was still alive, I had to accomplish this without anyone finding out or even suspecting I was behind it. The mobsters scared me more than the cops, but both were intimidating. Getting killed was bad, but going to prison for a long stretch was nearly as bad. Point 4. I had to do all of this on my own. Conspiracies are only as strong as the weakest conspirator, so the more people involved, the more likely I'd get caught. That's when I went to the basement and opened my weapon safe, a plan forming in my mind. I pulled out the Colt AR-15 I had owned for years, laying it on a table. I field stripped it and spent the next 15 minutes thoroughly cleaning and lubing the disassembled weapon. Next, I loaded 3 20-round clips with ammo and stacked them next to the rifle. I then took out my 9mm, repeating the process of cleaning and loading clips. In little more than 30 minutes, I placed everything in a duffel bag along with a black ski mask, black sweatpants, black shoes, socks, and a sweatshirt. I hesitated before deciding against using black shoe polish on my hands. That would be hard to explain if I was caught, and nearly impossible to remove for a few days. By the time I was done, the plan was almost fully formed. That's when I remembered something I had been ignoring and decided to check on, just in case it yielded anything of value. Strangely enough, it yielded a wealth of information that confirmed my hypothesis. Once logged in, I clicked on the sole remaining email. "Luke, I'm so sorry," she wrote. "By now, you know it all. You know I lied. You know I cheated. You may have even figured out who he is. If you haven't, his name is Charles Dunlop. He's a lawyer and a good one. I don't really know how it all got started. I remember being upset with you. Well, with me really, but I blamed you. I felt guilty because you do so much, taking care of the cooking, cleaning, and Kyle. Those were things I should have been doing, or at least helping you more with. On the other hand, I was so close to realizing my potential after 10 years of hard work. I felt guilty that I was achieving my goals at the expense of my family. How did this become your fault? I now realize I blamed you for taking up the slack I left while pursuing my career. I know it doesn't make sense. I see that now, but at the time, I thought that if you had pushed me more, I would have been forced to cut back at work and spend more time doing what I should have been doing. It's pretty messed up, right? Just writing this, it still doesn't make sense to me. I was blaming you because you were supporting my goals, and I was giving you very little in return. I don't know how Charlie spotted this, but he did. He saw my unhappiness and went out of his way to comfort me. I let him. I wish I had an excuse or justification that could somehow make all of this your fault, but I don't. None of it was your fault. Your sole mistake was being there for Kyle and me, always giving 110% without complaint. I know now the enormity of my mistake. In fact, I knew it that Saturday when I left you with Kyle to meet with Charlie. That's why I broke it off that day. I wanted to come home and somehow get you to forgive me, but you didn't. I don't blame you for any of this. If the roles had been reversed, I would have never forgiven you either. I do know a few things, though. For example, I know my biggest mistake wasn't cheating on you with Charles. Sure, that was probably unforgivable. Nor was my biggest mistake refusing to come clean and tell you everything, which was also unforgivable. No, my biggest mistake was ever telling you that I didn't love you anymore and didn't want to stay married. The first 2 mistakes were probably deal breakers, but the third mistake was the superglue that sealed the death of our marriage. I want you to know that I will never forgive myself for any of this, for cheating on you, for refusing to come clean, and worst of all, for ever allowing you to believe that any of this was your fault. The fault was mine and mine alone. So many times after you filed for divorce, I wanted to tell you all of this, but I saw your pain every day, the pain I caused you. Looking at that pain, I knew I didn't deserve you back, and that you deserved someone who would never do this to you. To this day, I can barely stand to look at you without my shame overwhelming me. In closing, Luke, I know that what I have done has ruined my marriage, my husband, my son, and all of us as a family. I wish I could take it back. I sit alone in my apartment every night, dreaming of the past and wondering what I was thinking. I want you to know that I have one last trial coming up, and it's a big one. I'm going to win it, and then I'll be offered the position I've always dreamed of, Chief of the Criminal Division. When they make me that offer, I'm going to resign. I'm going to rededicate myself to being a mother to our little boy. I only hope you won't prevent me from doing this. It's the only dream I now have to keep me sane, and I want to do my fair share so you can take the time to rebuild your own life after my actions. With eternal shame and everlasting love, Whitney'll admit it. My eyes were wet by the time I finished reading Whitney's confession. My mind was filled with what-ifs. What if she'd come clean that day? Would I have taken her back and tried to overcome her betrayal? What if I'd paid more attention months before when she began withdrawing? Could I have prevented the whole thing? The saddest word in the English language is if. Now my suspicions had been confirmed. All I could wonder was whether Whitney had ever pieced together Dunlop's scheme before she disappeared, and if so, how she had reacted upon learning that she destroyed her marriage to be with a man who didn't care about her or her problems, but only wanted to gain an advantage in a criminal case. My sadness turned to simmering rage as I deleted the message and wiped all traces of it from my hard drive. Unfortunately, I was unsuccessful in hiding my emotions when Kristen and Ben showed up. She took one look at me and turned to Ben, telling him to go outside and play, her eyes on me the whole time. "You know who it is, don't you?" she said when Ben was outside. "You know where she is." I didn't move. "What are you going to do?" she pressed. "I need you to watch Kyle tonight," was all I managed. "Luke," she pleaded, "you have to call the police. You can't do this on your own. Jesus, Luke, you could get killed. Then where will Kyle be?" I shook my head. "I can't." "Really?" Kristen hissed, her eyes darting outside to ensure the boys were out of earshot before turning back to me. "You're going to go out and act like some kind of cowboy? Maybe get killed or at least shot or stabbed, without thinking even for a second about what'll happen to Kyle if that happens? What the hell?" I hissed right back at her. "You think I haven't thought about that? But what happens if I call the cops, huh? I'll tell you. She gets killed so they can't get caught. That's what happens. If they haven't killed her already, then what do I tell Kyle?" "But Luke," she said, her eyes pleading with me to reconsider. "There's got to be another way." I shook my head. "I've been thinking about it all day since this morning when I figured it all out. There's no other way, believe me. You think I want to do this?" She stayed silent, her eyes pleading with me not to leave, the reality of my words sinking in. "Trust me," I said. "I've thought about nothing but Kyle. Bottom line is this. I can never again look at Kyle if Whitney's killed. If he has to go to his mother's funeral, I knew all along that maybe I could have stopped it. But if she dies, at least I can catch the person responsible." She was shaking now, the fear and enormity of the situation evident on her face. "Promise me you won't get hurt," she said. "Please, Luke, promise me you'll be careful." I tried to smile. "Just keep an eye on the boys tonight, and I'll be back by midnight or so, okay?" Tears were streaming down her cheeks, and I brushed them away with my fingertips. "Get yourself together," I said. "Keep an eye on the boys. It'll work out." She nodded. "Okay." I left at 8, just before the sun set. This plan had to be carried out at night. I had no idea how many of them there were, where I was going, or what I would do when I got there. Darkness and surprise would be my only allies. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw a car parked down the block slowly start rolling with its headlights turned off. I had company. I drove slowly, giving no one cause to pull me over and discover my stash of weapons. Getting caught would mean Whitney's disappearance for good. 20 minutes later, I cruised past Charles Dunlop's law office. There were no lights on and no cars in the parking lot. I kept my fingers crossed that he was home and that he actually lived at the address listed in the phone book. My plan was risky, but it seemed the only way to lure him out and get him to lead me to Whitney or, alternatively, her captors. I was still being followed, and I finally identified the driver when I passed through a well-lit intersection, Sergeant Adams. I was right. They knew I was hiding something and had guessed I intended to do something about it. Great, I thought. Now I had to avoid them while trying to save Whitney. I began running through scenarios in my mind, all of which depended on whether backup would be joining the detective. It had been like this during my military career. Make a great plan, set it in motion, and something comes along to disrupt it. Throughout history, great tacticians have dealt with changes and improvised solutions on the fly. Unfortunately, I wasn't a great tactician. I was a West Point-trained infantry leader who had been permanently sidelined in my first combat engagement. I hadn't thought like a soldier in nearly 20 years, and none of it was coming back as quickly as I had hoped. I pushed the newest developments from my mind as I pulled in front of Dunlop's house. The living room was lit, and I saw a figure moving inside through the gauzy drapes. It was now or never. I mulled over the plan again, knowing that if I followed through and didn't succeed, I would be signing Whitney's death warrant. There was no chance they would keep her alive if they thought the cops were onto them. Likewise, there was no way to get them to reveal their intentions unless they believed the police were closing in. Deciding they would probably kill Whitney either way if they hadn't already, I pulled the disposable cell phone from my pocket and dialed the pre-programmed number. Dunlop answered on the second ring. "Hello. This is going to be short and sweet," I said into the phone. "Who is this?" "Be quiet. This is a friend. That's all you need to know for now." He paused, then asked, "What do you want?" "You're being monitored. Office phones, cell phone, home phone." He said nothing, so I continued. "Wiretap warrants were signed this afternoon. Your name's all over one of them. You shouldn't have to guess whose names are on the other two. And you're sharing this with me because—" "I'll make myself known to you down the road," I said. "When I do, I'll expect you to show your appreciation. Your friends, too. How can I believe you? How can you afford not to?" I shot back. "Either way, this conversation's over. I'm not saying any more in case the bugs are already in place." With that, I snapped the cell phone shut, pulled into the far end of the cul-de-sac, and waited to see if Dunlop took the bait. I didn't see where Sergeant Adams had parked, but I assumed she was outside the cul-de-sac, where she'd see us both as we left. 10 minutes later, Dunlop strode out of his front door, looked left and right, then slid into his Cadillac and pulled out. I smiled, pleased with myself. I started my own car and followed, staying well behind him. Just like a scene from a movie, Sergeant Adams followed behind me. Within minutes, we were cruising down country roads at speeds nearing 70. My worst nightmare hit me as I tossed the cell phone out the window and into a creek. If I tried to keep up with Dunlop, Adams had a reason to pull me over, and Whitney might never be seen again. But if I didn't keep up, I'd lose him and Whitney would be killed. That's when I made my first improvisation. I decided to keep up with Dunlop and hoped Adams, and probably Gavers too, would realize I was following the kidnapper. If they knew I was holding back on them, then they had to know who I was following. I trusted them to let me keep following Dunlop rather than stop me and let him go. I pressed my foot on the accelerator to catch up with the disappearing tail lights ahead of me. 2 miles later, Adams had still not pulled me over. Instead, she was keeping pace with me about a quarter-mile back. I smiled, knowing we could lose each other on this long, lonely country road. Yet, just as I congratulated myself on my nerves of steel, the Cadillac's tail lights turned and disappeared. I slowed down to 50, not wanting to risk passing him too slowly if he was waiting in a turnoff ahead. Even at 50, I nearly missed the half-overgrown dirt trail leading into the woods. A few hundred yards into the woods, I saw a brief flicker of bouncing red tail lights, and I eased my car to a stop in the ditch ahead, pulling well off the road. Adams slowed down behind me. I pulled my mask down, grabbed the duffel bag, and was out of the car and into the woods before Adams saw where I'd gone. I watched from the edge of the woods as Adams slowed to a complete stop in the roadway parallel to my car. She flashed a light into my car, spoke briefly into a cell phone, then pulled in front of my car. I was well into the woods, walking a course parallel with the overgrown trail before I heard her car door slam in the distance behind me. It was a moonless night, and the undergrowth was still damp from the morning's rain. I was soaked from the waist down before I'd gone 50 yards, but adrenaline coursed through my veins, keeping my mind sharp. It had always been like this in the Army. Tense planning sessions followed by a calm before the storm, then heightened tension once the plan was in motion. This situation reminded me of that morning many years ago when I crossed the Iraqi frontier, knowing the enemy would be waiting with real weapons and that people were going to die. That morning, tension combined with a cold, numbing fear. My senses were so attuned that even the slightest sound had me on high alert. Now it was worse. I was out of practice, out of shape, and I'd lost the bravado of youth. 300 yards in, the trail meandered to the left and reached a break in the woods. I stopped there, looking at the open space in front of me. Down a gentle slope, no more than 75 yards away, sat a rusty, dilapidated metal shed. A red Cadillac was parked in front, next to an old Ford pickup truck. Without conscious thought, my eyes surveyed the terrain for tactical features. The shed sat in the middle of a small bowl in the earth, with the ground sloping down to it from where I stood. Good for me, bad for them. I would have the high ground, with the added benefit of forest concealment, while they would be pinned down and unable to pass without exposing themselves. The vehicles were parked close enough to make a run for them, and if they reached the cars, they'd have a chance of getting away. I couldn't fire at them if Whitney was with them. Too much chance of hitting her. Thus, the vehicles needed to be disabled. I noticed a propane tank about 60 feet to the left of the shed. It had to be avoided at all costs. There could be no chance of a stray shot hitting the tank and endangering us all. On the right side of the shed, I saw soft light coming from the windows. There was nothing else around except grass leading up the gentle slope to the edge of the forest. Picturing the angles in my mind, I made my decision. If I positioned myself at the edge of the woods to my right, I would have clear angles to see inside the shed and good shots at anyone coming out the door toward the vehicles. The only downside was that a missed shot could hit the propane tank, but that didn't faze me. From 75 yards away, down a hill with an AR-15, there was no way I would miss what I was aiming at. With my basic plan formed, I crept along the wood line to my left to commence my reconnaissance. Crouching low and staying at the edge, I circled around the bowl, keeping an eye out for sound and movement. When I reached the point opposite where I'd started, I took a deep breath, counted silently to 10, and scurried down the slope toward the shed. "I don't care about offing her, man," I heard a whiny voice say from inside the shed. The voice was slurred, and I assumed the windows were open. A strange odor wafted from inside, metallic and medicinal, off-putting. "Don't worry," another voice yelled at the first. "You won't have to do it. They're coming themselves to take care of it. We just need to wait for them here. It's still a murder rap if we get caught, though," the first voice said. "I didn't sign up for a murder rap. Kidnapping seems okay to you? Murder's out, but you'll face 20 or 30 years for kidnapping. You're okay with that?" Silence. "Do you hear that?" the first voice asked. "There's nothing out there," voice 2 said, lowering his voice. "You've been smoking too much of your own." Suddenly, I heard footsteps, then a shuffling and a muffled sound. A woman's voice, likely Whitney, realized with a sinking feeling. They were waiting for someone else to show up so they could harm her. "Might as well take the blindfold off," voice 2 said. "She won't be able to identify anyone after tonight." "Let them do it," voice 1 pouted. I'd heard enough. I made my way back up to the edge of the woods and moved clockwise along the wood line, scanning the ground ahead for firing lines to my right. As I moved, I spotted an open view of the doorway. I stopped, dropped the duffel bag, and retrieved my weapons. The Glock went into my waistband at the small of my back. Then, I laid flat, my body molding into the damp grass, cradling the rifle but against my chest. I lined up the sights and flicked the safety to semi-automatic. "This is where I'd have planted myself too," Gavers said from behind me. I froze, staying glued to the ground. I heard his pistol drop behind me. "Drop the rifle," he ordered. My body sagged as I flipped the rifle back to safe. "When we came out of the woods," he continued, his voice low and matter-of-fact, "you were already circling around pretty well. But you should have stayed lower and watched something other than the shed," I heard Gavers say. I felt the rustle of the undergrowth, then sensed his feet on the ground behind me. "I know what you're doing," he continued. "Good plan to keep them pinned in." "She's alive," I replied, my voice low. "She's in there, and she's alive." To my left, I heard someone take a sharp breath. Gavers was silent for a moment. "Did you hear her?" Adams asked. "Yes, it was definitely her. A woman. Her mouth was taped or something," I said, straining to listen. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear them. "How many?" Gavers asked. "2 for sure. I don't think there's anyone else, but definitely 2. One of them's Dunlop. The other is high on something, illegal substances, I think. You can smell it. Any more surprises before we cuff you to the tree over there?" Gavers asked. "There are more on the way," I replied. "They're waiting for someone else to show up. That someone is going to kill her and get rid of the body." I heard a snort from Adams. "But," her voice cut off as a pair of headlights emerged from the edge of the woods, slowly making their way down the gentle slope toward the shed. "You don't have any rules," I said, flipping the rifle back to semi-automatic. "Don't do it," Adams cautioned. "You need me," I insisted. "It's just the 2 of you, and now you're outnumbered big time. Without me, there's nothing you can do. They'll kill her. You know they will." I heard Gavers move quickly, though not silently. "Keep them pinned down," he whispered back at me before breaking from the edge of the woods. "Don't let whoever it is out of that car." Adam started to protest but thought better of it. Instead, she crouched down next to me. "You could have told us," she said. "And you wouldn't have believed me," I shot back, my eyes focusing on the car slowing down near the shed. I glanced to the right and saw that Gavers was still exposed, less than 20 feet down the slope. Back on the car, though, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I took a breath and squeezed the trigger. The car lurched just as the crack of my rifle echoed in the air. It took 2 shots to take out the left tire, but the car was now only 20 feet from the other vehicles. "What the hell?" someone shouted from below. I saw the front door swing open, revealing a tall, gaunt figure stepping into the light cast by the open door. I fired a shot high up the doorframe. "Don't hit him," Adams warned as the figure dropped to the ground, looking around wildly before scrambling back inside. "Shut up," I hissed, turning back to the car and putting 2 shots into the grill. Steam began hissing from under the hood almost immediately. They were well and truly screwed now, and I knew it. "Look out," Adams whispered, her voice losing excitement and turning flat. I glanced at the shed and saw Gavers with his back against it, his pistol held high. I shifted my aim back to the vehicles in front of the shed and fired 4 shots, taking out the front tires of both the Cadillac and the pickup truck. For good measure, I fired 2 rounds into the grills, and soon the Cadillac started spouting steam. I saw the passenger door open on the new vehicle, the one I knew contained at least one, if not both, of the suspects. I put a round into the door, and it slammed shut. "Look out," Adams shouted, urgency in her tone. I looked back, grabbing a fresh magazine as I did so. I saw Gavers holding up his hand and making a shooting signal toward the end of the shed nearest the vehicles. I slammed the magazine home, aimed high on the far side of the shed, and pumped 5 rounds into the building. At that moment, Gavers extended his arms and pistol through the open window. I saw only one shot before Gavers climbed through the window. The front door burst open at the same time, and Dunlop began careening around the vehicles and into the woods. "He's getting away," Adams shouted, pointing toward the propane tank. I ignored both Adams and the fleeing figure of Charles Dunlop. My eyes stayed locked on the suspects. They were still alive, and I had no doubt they were armed. "You," I called, keeping my eyes down the barrel. "Get your butt around behind them, then come in low. Stay in the tree line." But they've got guns, and Gavers is alone in that shed. If only one of them gets out of that car and to that shed, we'll have problems. Without another word, she sprinted off. A minute later, I saw someone being shoved out of the window from behind and falling to the ground with a thud. I recognized the hair and frail figure and allowed myself to breathe a sigh of relief. Whitney was safe for now. She started stumbling up the slope toward the woods, keeping the shed between her and the suspects. Good. I turned back to the suspects behind their car. I saw movement on the slope and knew Adams was coming down behind them. Needing to keep their attention on me, I fired 5 rounds into the front of their car. Without warning, an arm reached out from the passenger side of the car and fired 5 rounds in my direction. I hit the ground, trying to dig myself in as deeply as possible. The bullets whizzed past, striking the trees and the ground only 4 or 5 feet to my left. They had finally seen my muzzle flashes and knew where I was. I knew pistols were ineffective at that range. It only took one lucky shot to send me down for good. "Drop your guns," I heard Adams scream. I looked up to see her standing behind and to the left of the car, arms extended with her pistol aimed at them. After a brief pause, I saw movement and heard the thud as the pistols hit the ground. Next, Gavers flew out of the building and took up a position behind and to the right of the vehicle. He said something, but I couldn't hear him. He spoke again, and both car doors opened. The suspects slowly emerged, lying flat on the ground next to the car. Once I saw them cuffed, I hopped up and grabbed my duffel bag. With one last look at the shed below, I turned right and began sprinting along the tree line. As I ran, I spotted Whitney just inside the woods. I slowed down. She was staring at the shed, shaking uncontrollably, her face a mask of horror. "You'll be okay," I whispered as I drew nearer. She twisted away, trying to make herself as small as possible. I stopped in front of her and held out my hand. "It's me," I said softly. "You're going to be okay." In slow motion, Her hand reached out to mine, but when our fingertips touched, she jerked her hand back. Then she reached out again, clasping me in a tight grip. "Come on," I urged. "Let's get you back to them, okay?" Whitney didn't seem to hear me, but she followed along without hesitation. As we neared the shed, I stopped. "You're safe now," I said. Her hands squeezed mine tighter, refusing to let go. "I've got to get out of here, Whit," I said. "You've got to let go. You're safe now." Still, she wouldn't let go. "If I'm still here when backup arrives, it's going to be bad. I'll get arrested. The Lowbries may come after me. They may come after Kyle. Whitney, you've got to let me go." That seemed to sink in, and she finally released my hand. "Remember," I said, placing my hand on her chin, "I was never here. Got it?" Her head bobbed up and down in acknowledgement. Without another word, I turned and sprinted to my right. Once back in the tree line, I made my way around the punch bowl and up the path toward the road. I had to get out of there before any more cops showed up. I hoped Gavers and Adams would keep their mouths shut. Near the road, I heard sirens wailing in the distance. They'd be there any minute. Reaching into my pocket for the car keys, I heard a scraping sound from behind me. I turned, and without warning, the wind was knocked from my lungs as I was slammed backward to the ground. "Who the hell are you?" Dunlop screamed, clawing at the mask on my face. I said nothing, concentrating all my effort on breaking free from him. He cocked his right arm back to punch me, but I pushed off with all my strength and rolled into him, neutralizing whatever blow he had planned. Still, he wouldn't let go. Rolling again onto my back, I felt the hard metal digging into my upper buttocks and knew what I had to do. Continuing the roll, I reached back and drew the Glock, holding it tightly. I struck Dunlop repeatedly on the side of the head until I felt his body go limp. Not waiting to check for a pulse, I scrambled to my feet and got into my car. 15 seconds later, I was driving away from the sirens, popping one after another over the rise in the road behind me. To my relief, I saw them all come to a halt near Adam's car parked on the side of the road. Slowing back down to the speed limit, I took the very next left 2 miles up and made my way toward my last stop of the night before going home. Dressed now in jeans, a sweatshirt, and deck shoes, I stood at the edge of the abandoned gravel pit. The adrenaline was finally fading, and my body was overcome with fatigue. Still, I needed to get rid of everything. With a mighty heave, I threw the duffel bag containing my clothes and what was left of the ammo as far into the dark waters as I could. I watched it float for a moment before sinking, weighed down by the 5 bricks inside. I had already disposed of the rifle's disassembled bolt mechanism in a creek on my way to the pit, and the rest of both weapons had been broken down and tossed into various monitoring wells still scattered around the area. I found it hard to believe anyone would bother searching for them, and the whole point would be moot if Gavers and Adams came for me. Neither had seen my face, but Adams surely had my license plate number from following me to the shed. Better safe than sorry, I thought. The living room was dark when I entered. "Are you all right?" Kristen asked from the couch. I stopped, relieved but overcome with exhaustion. "I'm fine," I whispered. I heard her sniffle, then a small sob broke from her lips. She squeezed me tightly, her robe and pajamas soft and warm. I just wanted to hold her against me forever. But quickly, my strength began to fade. "Whitney," Kristen said. "She's fine too, alive and for the most part unharmed." "And whoever it was?" she asked, breaking the hug. I saw her shiny eyes searching mine. "Cops got him," I said. She hugged me again, but I began to sag toward the floor. Kristen helped me to the couch. Once seated, Kristen leaned in close, her warmth surrounding me as she kissed my lips, nose, and forehead. "It's going to be okay," she whispered to herself repeatedly, as if trying to reassure herself. I didn't respond, too tired to care, and instead allowing her to express her emotions. "I was so scared," she finally admitted, sitting beside me on the couch, holding me tightly. "Me too," I replied, feeling myself start to drift off. She noticed my fatigue and brushed her cheek with the back of her hand. "Go to sleep," she said gently, then pulled me sideways so my head rested in her lap. My last thoughts were how comforting it felt while Kristen ran her fingers through my hair and massaged my shoulder. It was soothing and calming, almost like a dream, but I knew it wasn't. Before long, my breath became ragged with impending sleep, and Kristen leaned in, kissing me softly. "Let it go," she encouraged, and once again, darkness washed over me. I awoke on the couch, covered in a blanket with a pillow under my head. Sun Tzu was nestled into my chest, snoring lightly. "Hungry?" Kristen asked, leaning in close. She looked bright and cheerful, well-rested and happy. I started to say no, but a low gurgling from my stomach startled the puppy, who looked at me wide-eyed. Kristen chuckled and didn't wait for me to respond. She disappeared into the kitchen. Sun Tzu jumped off me and followed her, tail wagging, likely anticipating food. Sitting up, I tried to stretch the ache from my joints and fatigue from my muscles. "Hey, Dad," Kyle chirped from the table, his mouth half full of cereal and a broad grin on his face. "Hey, Mr. Patterson," Ben chimed in. "Morning, fellas," I said, yawning. "Sit," Kristen ordered, bringing me a bowl of oatmeal and a plate piled with eggs, bacon, and toast. "Smells good," I said, sliding into the chair at the head of the table. "Eat up," she said, smiling as she set the food in front of me. She returned with a cup of coffee and placed that too in front of me. "You didn't have to do this," I said, starting on the toast and eggs, "but I'm glad you did." "Thanks." "You're welcome," Kristen replied, sitting at the other end of the table and sipping her coffee. I polished off my breakfast in record time while Ben and Kyle chatted about school, classmates, and video games. Sun Tzu darted around the table, yipping the whole time, eagerly waiting for someone to drop something. Kristen watched it all with an easy smile on her face. It felt like a family, I realized, much like what Whitney, Kyle, and I had once shared, but with a dog and another boy at the table. It was nice. "So, what are you going to do today?" Kristen asked as I stood to take my dirty dishes to the dishwasher. "Just bum around, I suppose," I said, my chest tightening. I was surprised the police hadn't already appeared and dragged me away in handcuffs. "Hang around the house, get some paperwork done, get my class notes in order for next week," I added. "I was thinking," Kristen began, "we could order pizza and watch movies really late." Kyle interjected, "Yeah, can we?" I looked at him, then turned to Kristen. She shook her head. "If you've got other plans or want to do something else, that's fine. Movies and pizza sound great to me." Her smile could have lit a city. "Sounds great to me too." Then it was settled. Taking the boys' dishes, I put them into the dishwasher. "Might as well plan a slumber party," I joked. I won't say the look Kristen shot me was overly excited, but I couldn't help but remember my dream from the night before. I also knew I would need a cold shower soon. "I'll take them to school with me," Kristen said, putting her coffee cup into the dishwasher before turning to me. "You get some rest. You're going to need it." She leaned in and kissed me on the cheek before blowing a gentle breeze into my ear. I wanted to act on the moment then and there, but the boys ran out with their backpacks in hand, and they were all gone before I could make a move. I was dozing on the couch when the doorbell rang. My eyes flew open, and I turned to the clock. It was just after 10. I approached the door like a condemned man walking to the gallows. "Professor Patterson," Gavers said when I opened the door. Without a word, I stepped back and motioned for him and Sergeant Adams to come inside. "You got any weapons here?" Gavers asked once they were inside. I nodded. "Gun safe in the basement." He swept his arm. "Lead the way." I looked at him, unable to read his expression. Adams was likewise a blank page. I turned and led them to the basement, flipping on the lights when we got there. "Cool," I heard Gavers say as we wound our way between the battle scenes toward the corner of the long room. "Whatever," Adams mumbled, bored with my hobby. I spun the combination on the gun safe, pulled it open, and stood back. Adams leaned in, then turned over her shoulder and said, "They're not here." "Good," he shouted back, kneeling down and taking a close look at the diorama filled with men on the battlefield. "Crazy stuff," he said, then looked at me and smiled. "That must have been one rotten war, huh?" I nodded, wondering what they were setting me up for. I heard Adams whistle long and low, and I turned to see her holding a small wooden box open in her hand, her eyes darting between me and the contents inside. "I suppose this explains it," she said to Gavers, who had moved on to study the Carthaginian tactics at the table. His eyes narrowed as he walked toward us, taking the box from her. He looked inside, then at me. "Where's the citation?" I frowned. Besides my fellow soldiers, Whitney was the only one who had ever seen it, the only one who knew what happened that day. His expression warned me that I had better show him. With a resigned shrug, I reached between them and back into the gun safe, withdrawing the folder containing the citation. Without a word, I handed it to him. Gavers ran his fingers over the cheap plastic folder, then flipped it open and read aloud. "Department of the Army, this is to certify that the Secretary of Defense has awarded the Silver Star to First Lieutenant Lucas M. Patterson, United States Army." He continued reading, "First Lieutenant Lucas M. Patterson conducted himself with valor in the face of the enemy on February 24, 1991, while serving as a platoon leader for the 3rd Squadron, 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, 7 Corps. First Lieutenant Patterson was part of the spearhead element invading Iraq. Shortly after crossing the border, the lead elements were targeted with small arms fire." Gavers read the rest of the citation to himself, then went back and read it again. Once finished, he handed the citation to Adams and fixed me with a stare. My eyes darted between him and Adams, who was now reading the citation, her eyes widening as she continued. "You held off almost 200 men for half an hour with only 2 other guys to help, and killed at least 29 enemy soldiers in the engagement. All with bullets and shrapnel in your legs and hips and belly?" Gavers finished. "You some kind of goddamn Superman or Rambo?" "I'm a history professor," I replied. They both continued staring at me. I said nothing in response. Reaching over, I took the citation from Adams and tossed it back into the gun safe on top of the box of medals. Adams now looked at me in awe, while Gavers simply gave an easy smile. I realized he had been there during the Gulf War. He was about the right age and had that military bearing that never really goes away. They drill that into your soul during officer candidate school. "You got any coffee?" he finally asked. "Sure," I said, leading them back upstairs. I watched them at the table while I ground the beans and poured water into the coffee maker. They never said a word, but exchanged more than a few glances and raised eyebrows. For 5 long minutes, I stood at the counter, wondering when the hammer was going to fall. Just as I reached for 3 mugs and the carafe of freshly brewed coffee, I saw Gavers fix Adams with a stare. "Well, yeah," she said. I poured us all a cup and then sat at the table. "How's Whitney?" I asked. "A wreck," Gavers said, taking a sip of his coffee. "Dehydrated, mostly. Still pretty much in shock." "She'll come out of it," Adams said. "A few days of rest and relaxation, and she'll be fine. Except for the nightmares," I muttered, more to myself than to them. "Yeah," Gavers said, staring into his cup of coffee. "They don't go away, do they?" I didn't respond. "The Labries are in custody now," Adams continued, "charged with kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment, and a whole load of other things that will keep them there forever. Dunlop is handcuffed to a bed just down the hall from Whitney," Gavers said. "Looks like he fell while trying to escape and hit his head pretty hard. A bad concussion, but nothing permanent." I nodded, trying to hide my relief at how they had decided to play this. "Strange thing about serious head injuries," Adams added with a smile. "Seems they wipe out shorter memory. The worse the head trauma, the longer the memory lapse." "He can't remember what he had for lunch yesterday," Gavers summed up. "Weird, huh?" "Yeah, weird," I agreed. "There was another guy there too," Gavers said, now getting into his role and pretending he was telling all of this to a total stranger. "Manny Samuelson, local meth maker, dealer, and all-around scumbag." "Per Manny?" I asked, not really caring. "Not really," Adams started laughing. "Second a-hole Gavers here shot him in the ass, right next to the other one already there." "Pretty messy," Gavers agreed, pinching his face in disgust. "How did you two crack it?" I asked, relaxing and taking a sip of my coffee. "Just solid police work," Gavers explained. "Following up the leads," Adams added. I smiled from ear to ear. "Well done. Really, just well done." "Thanks," Gavers chuckled. "Tell our bosses that," Adams groused. Still, Gavers said, "I'd just love to know why Dunlop decided to drive out there after sundown. I mean, if he hadn't done that, we'd have never found her." Poor Sergeant Adams would have just spent all night alone in her car down the block. I shrugged. Maybe he needed to make sure nothing was wrong. Gavers raised his eyebrows. Maybe. I continued. He got a phone call that scared him. Maybe someone told him the cops were on to him and had wiretapped all of his phones. Something like that. Gavers nodded, narrowing his eyes. Wonder who did that. I mean, pretty risky. A lot could have gone wrong. I returned his stare, agreeing with his assessment and feeling relieved that nothing had gone wrong. My guess was that the longer she was missing, the more likely she was dead. Whoever had taken her probably wanted to get rolling before they killed her. We were silent for a moment, all of us sipping our coffee. I wonder something, though, I said. Oh. Gavers responded. Why was she still alive? I mean, why didn't they just kill her immediately? Adams answered. Dunlop remembered all of that. They were planning to have her leave a message sometime next week, like Wednesday or Thursday. A message saying she was now convinced the whole thing was a setup, that she had taken off because she didn't want anything else to do with it. That sounds a bit far-fetched to me, I said. Gavers shrugged. They were screwed and they knew it. He'd cozied up to Whitney a long time ago, trying to get information from her about the case. He wouldn't tell us how cozy, but we can fill in the blanks. Either way, that didn't really work out so well. Then, once the trial got going, she was really hammering them. They figured their best shot was a mistrial. Once the jury is seated, if the mistrial is intentionally caused by the prosecution, jeopardy attaches, and they can't be tried again. The whole thing goes away. Ballsy, I said. We finished our coffee in silence. Well, screw it, Adams said, pushing back from the table. Just wanted to let you know your boy's mom was okay and all. Thanks, I said, standing along with them. It's been a pleasure, Gavers said at the door, turning to shake my hand with a firm grip. The pleasure's been all mine, I assure you, he smiled, then turned and walked toward his car. You ever want to talk or something, give me a call, okay? Sergeant Adams said, pressing her card into my hand and lingering over the handshake just a moment longer than necessary. Thanks. Let's go, Sergeant, Gavers called out before sliding behind the steering wheel of the car in the driveway. She gave a quick smile, then turned and walked to the car. The following Monday morning, I was called into Professor Whitman's office. Your former wife is doing well, I take it? I nodded. She'll be fine. She got out of the hospital yesterday. Good, good, he nodded, then stared out the window at students shuffling under the autumn sun. I'm going to miss it, he said. Miss what? I asked. Dean Whitman, he said. Sorry, but I wasn't just pandering. Even the president of Chadwick never called Whitman by his first name. He'd been around too long and had done too much for the institution to not be given his due. He turned back to face me, a peaceful smile on his lips. I'm retiring at the semester break, Luke. I had been expecting this, but it still hit me in the chest. You're doing okay, right? He nodded. I figure I've got another 5 or 6 years left. I want to spend those years pulling together all of my notes, theories, and writings I've gathered over the years. My magnum opus, so to speak. I remained silent, and after a moment, he continued, I'll be on staff still, of course, emeritus status. That'll entitle me to a research assistant to help, but I'm giving up my teaching duties and my position as dean of the department. But you can still... No, he said, his voice softening. It needs to be someone who teaches, a scholar and a teacher both. And that's you, Luke, if you want it. I sat back. It would come with more responsibility, of course, and more pay too. But I'd have one less class to teach to make up for the extra administrative duties I'd be assuming. I think you know something was coming, but still weren't prepared when it arrived. That's how I felt. You'll do just fine, he said, his smile calming me. I smiled, leaving his office completely at peace for the first time in months. My life seemed to be coming around. I believed I could be happy again. It was late October before Kristen again joined me in a more intimate way. We had spent the intervening month getting to know each other better, and our friendship quickly blossomed into love. On Thanksgiving weekend, she and Ben moved in with Kyle, Sue, and me. Most of December was spent Christmas shopping. We were walking down the crowded mall when a voice froze us. Professor Heather Farley was calling, shouldering her way through the throng of shoppers and pulling Randy along behind her. Merry Christmas, I said, smiling. Merry Christmas, they both said in unison, her voice cheerful while Randy's was more subdued. I introduced Kristen, and another round of holiday wishes followed. So, I said, wanting to get my shopping finished, you two sticking around here for the holidays? Heather smiled at me, then turned to Randy and leaned in to kiss him. Yeah, he lives too far away for us to be together. If we go home, we decided to just stay here. Randy's bashful smile told me he was embarrassed by the attention. Strangely, Kristen's expression was even more adoring as she smiled at his blush. Good, I said, interrupting their thoughts. Since neither of you is apparently all that busy, I've got some more things you need to get for me. You're kidding, Randy said. Not a chance, Heather agreed. I shrugged. If you change your mind. They managed to slip away before I could try to foist more work on their holiday break. She has a crush on you, Kristen said, watching them walk away. I chuckled. Looks more to me like they're in love with each other, which I'd have never seen coming. By the way, Kristen elbowed me. Men can be so blind sometimes. I turned, leaned in, and pecked her on the cheek. Blinded to all but you, babe. She made a gagging gesture with her fingers in her throat. I laughed. All but me, Kristen said, giving me a teasing look. Whitney phoned 3 days before Christmas. We'd barely spoken since she'd gotten out of the hospital. She'd been tongue-tied every time I'd seen her, which was usually during her visitation periods with Kyle. Each time she looked at me, a haunted expression crossed her face, deepening when Kristen was around. I was thinking, she said, her voice barely a whisper, maybe I should be with you on Christmas Day. I can just take him for a while on Christmas Eve and get him back by 10 or so. Not a chance, I said. Ben's going to his dad's house, and Kyle's going with you. Kristen and I are going back to bed to catch up on all the sleep we're going to miss out on Christmas Eve. It's just that he's going to get bored spending all day and night with me, she said. Nonsense. He'll be bored here too. He'll have his new presents to play with. He'll have them at your place too, she countered. She said nothing to that. What's wrong? She mumbled something, and I asked her to repeat it. I guess I'm just trying to figure out a way to pay you back for what? For everything, Luke. For taking care of Kyle. For saving me. Because I was all over you? I said. And you were still there for all of us? Saving you, she said. Karen Adams and Aaron Gavers came and saw me in the hospital before you and Kyle got there. I knew it was you in the mask. I mean, duh, right? When I brought this up, Karen told me the whole story, and they made a couple of things pretty clear. Number one, they'd have never been able to save me on their own. It was your plan that tipped their hand and got Dunlop to go to where I was. Two, if I ever told a soul, you'd be in real danger. Not just the danger of prosecution, either. Danger of retaliation from the Lowberries. I reminded her Kyle could get caught in the crossfire. I know, she said. So let's not talk about it anymore, okay? But you've got to let me show you I'm sorry and thankful too for all of it. I was silent. Please? You want to show me you're sorry? Maybe you've learned something. Fine. Then don't be late for your visitation. Don't blow them off. Spend as much time with Kyle as you can. He deserves a mother too. But Kristen is not his mother. You are. Always have been. Always will be. When you're not there for him, he feels rejected. So you want to show me you're sorry and appreciative and all that? I'm not asking you for anything, I said. Just don't leave me here to pick up the pieces because you've blown him off for visitation again for any reason. From now on, Kyle needs to be first in your life, not your job. Fair enough. She paused for a moment, then whispered, Fair enough. Good, I said, calming down. Then have a Merry Christmas and don't be late. I heard her sniffle with tears. I'll be there. And Merry Christmas to you too. And to Kristen and Ben. We rang off. Christmas morning was like being back in the army. It consisted of Ben and Kyle jumping on our bed shortly after 4, all excited to go unwrap their presents from Santa. 20 minutes later, still bleary-eyed with mugs of coffee and hot cocoa prepared, the boys tore into their gifts. Kristen and I had agreed to spend the same amount on each boy, shopping together and buying all gifts from Santa. We wanted them both to know that neither of us would play favorites. That subtlety seemed lost, though, in the room full of opened gifts. What wasn't lost, however, was that not all presents between Kristen and me had been exchanged. "Dad," Kyle said, hands on his hips and eyebrows raised, "when are you going to give Kristen her present after you leave?" Kristen looked at me with raised eyebrows, then a smile curled her lips. "Strange," she said. "I've got a present for you too, but that only gets opened when they're gone." "Really?" I said. Her expression told me she was serious and that I'd really like it. Whitney and Tyler appeared at the same time to pick up Kyle and Ben, respectively. "So you're Whitney," Tyler said, shaking her hand after wishing her a Merry Christmas. "The prosecutor who gave us all a big scare a while ago." She looked at the floor, then nodded. "Well, I'm glad you're safe," he said, then paused, furrowing his brow and looking at her strangely. "Strange coincidence. My first book was about something like that, about an ex-wife who disappears without a trace. But in that one, the husband ran off and saved her." Whitney's head shot up to meet his eyes. Her face softened as she said, "I guess there just wasn't enough time for Luke to get in on the action." He laughed. "Guess not. Still, I'm glad you're okay." Whitney turned to me with a soft look. The haunted expression was gone, replaced by a warmth she hadn't bestowed upon me since before Charles Lott and Dunlop had appeared on the scene. I felt a pang in my heart for what had transpired between us, but then Kristen placed her hand on my forearm, and the regret was replaced with calm satisfaction at where I'd landed in life. "So who goes first here?" I asked. "I will," Kristen said. "Give me 5 minutes, then come into the bedroom," she said, a spark in her eyes signaling that she meant 5 minutes on the dot. No sooner, no later. I kept my eyes on the second hand of my watch and opened the door right on time. The sight before me took my breath away, my heart racing as I took in the moment. "I'm not going to lie to you," Kristen said. "Since my second divorce, I haven't been completely celibate. Pretty close, though. I needed some help to get through a lot of lonely nights." I tore the wrapping off a box I found on the bed, opening it with wonder. She smiled as she explained, "When we moved in a month ago, I hid this from you in the attic. I guess I was ashamed or something, but the past month, hell, the past 4 months, have been the happiest I've had in a long time. I decided I didn't want to hide anything from you." An excited grin spread across my face as she continued, "So, I didn't really buy you a present. Not with money anyway. Instead, I thought I'd give you my total trust, access to all of my secrets. I want you to know that I'm not hiding anything from you and that I never will." I looked into the box, my mind racing with possibilities. Reaching inside, I pulled out a toy and asked, "What exactly do you want me to do with these things?" "Anything," she said breathlessly, her eyes closing. I leaned in to kiss her, and she kissed me back. Once we were done, we collapsed onto the bed, feeling content. I awoke to Kristen kissing me. "So, where's my present?" I opened my eyes, got up, and went to the top shelf of my closet, retrieving a small box. Turning, I held it up to Kristen. When she saw it, her eyes glistened with tears, and a sad smile formed on her lips. "Please tell me it's not." I hesitated, then handed it to her with trembling fingers. As she began to open the small box, my heart raced. Once it was unwrapped, she looked at the ring inside. "I want to get married," I said, keeping my eyes on her. "You're my best friend. You've been there for me through the worst of times, and now I want you to be with me for the best of times." She looked at me, then back at the ring. "But my past, I don't care about the past." The tears started flowing then, and I could see the conflict on her face. "I don't want to hurt you, Luke. I'm damaged goods." I cupped her chin and turned her head to face me. "You made some mistakes," I said gently. "Sure, they were major mistakes, and they were probably mostly your fault, but that was then, years ago. You're not that person anymore." "But what if I am?" I shook my head. "People learn from their mistakes. I believe that. You've learned. You'll never do it again. But how can you know?" "I just know." She looked at the ring, then at me, and back at the ring again. I waited, my heart pounding, ready for any response. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, she started nodding her head, tears of joy mixing with laughter. "I never want to lose you." "I never want to lose you either," I replied, hugging her tightly. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like,